Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Krista Bessinger, the Director of Investor Relations. I'm just very quickly going to cover the Safe Harbor Statement and then turn it over to Mary and Eric. So before we begin, I would like to note that our comments and answers to questions may contain forward-looking statements regarding Google's business outlook. Our actual results may differ from those made in any forward-looking statements due to a number of risks and uncertainties. These risks are detailed in our public filings with the SEC. Also, please note that a webcast replay of this session will be available on our Investor Relations website in a few hours. We routinely post important information on our Investor Relations website, located at investor.google.com, and we encourage you to make use of that resource. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mary.
Thank you, Krista, Maria, Vic, David, and Eric for coming. We've moved the schedule back 10 minutes. Eric's been in the building for 15, but we finally got him in the room. For my disclosure, go to our website for all information you need to have. So Eric, thanks for coming. You did take away the glowing introduction with this moderately late start, so it was glowing. But with that said,
I'm much more interested in my criticism than my successes.
We can do that now, or we can do that later. So one of the things I just want to start out with, there's been a lot of chatter in the media and other places lately that the search market is settled and done. And what's your view on that?
Well, there's obviously a lot of innovation ahead of us. If you look at what happened, we had a bug where we put a malware statement out for users, and in that time, Yahoo searches gained very, very quickly. It looks like people will move very quickly from one search engine to another for any one of reasons. We've looked at this pretty carefully. A majority of people actually say they use more than one search engine. And of course, Microsoft is working very hard to build a competitive search engine, and of course, recently leaked more details about what they're doing. So we have all of that activity, and then of course we have other activity as well, including new entrants who are trying to combine search with other things. So I think search as it's defined, right, as Google has historically defined it or defined by Google, is not settled at all. It's interesting to note that people said the same thing 10 years ago about search with a different company.
And they've said it about operating systems today, and we had an interesting panel a moment ago, which it leads to a question that you worked at Sun, where the network was the computer. You competed and partnered with Oracle, which believed the network computer was the future. Netbooks are getting a lot of traction. What's your view of how that market plays out?
Well, this is all part of cloud computing, and whatever term you want to use, let's use cloud computing. And cloud computing is one of those changes that is going to happen regardless of whether the companies that are participating in the ecosystem allow it or not, because the technology will make it happen. I think everybody here knows what cloud computing represents. You could think about it in all the obvious ways, right? So for example, rather than buying a piece of software for a client, the JavaScript and Ajax code comes over to your browser and makes it very powerful. All of that technology is getting much more mature. But it is a fact that we live on very high-performance wireless broadband networks, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. Those networks are getting much, much stronger. So to me, the more interesting question is, what can you do as a consequence of cloud computing that you couldn't do before? And a way of thinking about that is that IT systems today are so, and excuse the broad overstatement, are so slow in the way in which they evolve. They're so stuck in the systems and parameters and architecture that they were built that you have an opportunity to build a whole new generation of applications which cycle much faster for IT, that integrate information in ways that could never be done before. In the same way that you can do this for the web, where now, because everybody's online, you have a lot of information that you can get about user behavior that you can either mine or build products for or do new and interesting things for.
So I'm going to.
I didn't really answer your question about netbooks. If you want to talk about netbooks for a sec. Netbooks are the next generation of the small device that the OLPC was trying to talk about. And what's particularly interesting about netbooks is the price point that they talk about. And it makes sense that eventually it will make sense for operators and so forth to subsidize the use of those books because they can make services revenue and advertising revenue on their consumption. That's another new model that's coming. The products today are not completely done. There are things that are missing. It's perfectly possible that operating systems that are Linux-based will become a significant player in that space where there historically have not been significant players in the PC space.
Okay. One of the things we might want to talk about is how carriers end up playing, how the financials end up, but we can get there. I wanted to ask a couple questions about search, a couple questions about financials, one or two on video, one or two on mobile, and just turn it over to folks in the room. But on the search side, and this is an economy question as well, query growth has remained strong, high teens, 15, 20% for a while. Our data, for what it's worth, indicates it's still there. Cost per click has been declining, was negative in the last quarter, but only by about 2%. Any trends you can give us to update it on how you play through a more difficult economic environment and any real-time information?
Well, first place, I don't think I need to talk to this audience about the state of the global economy, and I view the situation as pretty dire. The combination of everything that we have seen does not appear to have a current bottom. I worked hard to promote the stimulus package, not because it was perfect, but because I thought that the governments, and I believe governments should act very broadly to address the sort of historic issues that everybody's aware of. So during this time, what's happening is people are using the internet more. It obviously will affect the online advertising market simply because our systems are so tightly tuned that if customers are buying less, it will eventually, we don't know exactly what, it will eventually be reflected in CPCs and CPMs. So it's important, I think, to say right up front that we are not immune. We, Google, and the online advertising market are not immune to this. We may be better positioned from an advertising perspective than other advertisers because our advertising can be sold to a salesperson. But ultimately, the confusion in companies, the thing, oh my God, what are we going to do? The sort of real pain that is being felt by corporations worldwide will translate to our world.
What are some of the, we know what the negative issues are with the economy. We know what the negative issues are with regards to online commerce and offline commerce. What are some of the positive signals that you're seeing on the core search business that might relate to increased queries using the word coupon, or increased products being liquidated and people finding bargains, or any data points that are, while they may be small in total, are positive?
Well, every data point that we have is obvious, right? So what happens is that when the query shifted from basically mortgages to mortgage help to mortgage refinance to help to lawyers to help me prevent my house from being foreclosed. Right. I don't know if that's a good story or bad, but it's all obvious. It's all playing out in real time. Another way of saying it is the things that you see on television are really true. That's another way to say it, because we see it. So the areas that have been most hit on the online world are the same as the ones that you'd imagine in the offline world. So things like travel and automobiles and financials and so forth. And consumers are smart, so they use the internet to now then look for bargains in that space. So they do, in fact, look for discount trips if they're going to travel, although that volume is off and so forth. We haven't seen anything unusual, and what's interesting about it is that from our perspective, aside from running the business much more tightly, in other words, trying to actually make profits for a change on some of these businesses, we haven't fundamentally changed our strategic view, which is that the internet is a part of everybody's life, and that innovation in terms of new products will really enable people to do some amazing things. We've taken a position, for example, that the person should really be the search. It should really not just be a search that you do, but really be about your viewpoint, your history, and again, with your permission, we can store that kind of information.
You mentioned you're trying to make profits from businesses that hadn't been profitable before. You have a new CFO, seems like right guy, right time.
Very much so.
If you could provide us any thoughts on the kind of changes he's been able to make. Two obvious observations on the financials. OpEx per employee went down 6% last quarter. It's still high relative to a lot of other companies,
but our profitability is too.
Your profitability is still high. So there. Touche. And CapEx as a percent of revenue was down dramatically. How should we? And free cash flow was up 70%.
Well, first place, we like to generate cash. A good metric in any situation is if you can grow your profits on an absolute basis, and if you can generate pretty good free cash flow, you're going to get through this. And so we've taken that position internally. Patrick is our CFO. Is particularly good at doing business reviews. And so we've been going through systematically business after business. And it won't surprise long-term followers of Google that in our sort of hyper-growth period, we did not have the necessary systems in place, budgeting and the sort of estimation. We're putting those in place today, and in fact, largely are in place. So Google management spends most of its time doing business reviews today, looking at new products, how will this new product really change user behavior, what are the new ideas around advertisers, and we have a lot of that coming. When we finally get through all of the fear and the sort of concern that advertisers have about the world around them, I can tell you that they understand the notion of a guaranteed sale. They understand that if they put money into online advertising that's measurable, they understand that we can prove to them they'll get their sale. And by the way, in this economy, you need sales.
You did an exchange program with P&G in the, I'll call it October, November timeframe of last year, where you said, these guys, these are my words, P&G doesn't get what we're doing. Maybe we don't fully understand their wants and needs. Let's do a pen pal employee swap. What were some of the learnings from that? How important was it? And have you been able to translate it into anything either with P&G or with other large advertisers that spend 95% of their budgets offline?
Yeah.
Is there anything tangible?
The large, in the case of consumer packaged goods, people are trying to figure out how to use the internet to achieve their objectives. Many of the organizations don't fundamentally understand at some level how to use the emergent online communities to market within those communities. So the project that we did with P&G was really about getting, and we literally put people in their buildings and they put people in ours, was to exchange sort of how to do that because they're one of the innovators in that space. So based on that, we changed the way we market to sort of consumer goods companies by talking to them not so much on traditional text queries, which we've been saying, if somebody types in diapers, you should advertise against that, because everybody sort of understands that. But how you can use targeted online advertising within the communities, the blogging communities, Facebook, those sorts of groups that fundamentally are where your customers are getting information. The fact of the matter is that these days, if you're a consumer, the sophisticated consumers spend a lot of time online before they make a purchase. And even if they don't do that in the first purchase, once they have the product and once they're using it, they tend to join affinity groups that are part of that product. Diapers being an obvious example as a metaphor for new mothers who are interested in learning about new products and new ways in which they can take care of their new family.
But have you been, anything, has P&G, I don't want to pigeonhole P&G, but you got insights, but have you seen any translation? Yeah.
Well, I'd rather not.
Are you doing the employee swap with other companies as well?
We're going to. We're doing it carefully because you have to be careful about intellectual property. And I don't want to talk about the specifics, Lenny, so that's their data. But we like that model. One of the ways that you can sort of affect change is sort of direct contact, literally put the people together, and that's new for us.
So if we look at the average company and the average consumer, spending has been slowing down for a year. There appears to be a bit of a freeze right now on action for a variety of reasons. But to your point, companies actually really do need customers.
Yeah.
At some point, this becomes unfrozen. Theoretically, the online medium becomes unfrozen faster. Any thoughts on how that might play out when it plays out? Let's say the economy turns in quarter X. When we come out of it, are the indications that you're seeing positive in the direction of online gaining more share from offline than it has over this long period when it should have been gaining more share than it has?
Well, first place, so online continues to gain share in many, many ways. Share of mind, share of dollars, and so forth. I don't think there's any new news there. And there are more and more online choices. It's worth trying to figure out when this will occur. And for the next few quarters, things are going to be very, very tough. So we're talking about 2010, I think, if you're talking to the other CEOs, talking to customers, everybody's sort of assuming that 2009 is a tough, tough year. So the first question is, what can you do in 2009? And our sales force goes into the customer and says, you need revenue now. This is the quickest way to get revenue now. In many cases, customers are struggling with contractual commitments to offline advertising, for example, or the overall advertising budget has been cut so dramatically that they really don't have a lot of room. And so there's a political dynamic that goes within the customers. Hopefully that'll resolve fairly quickly. It's obviously in their interest and ours if that does. The other thing that's going on is that there's an increasing willingness to try new systems in the enterprise. We have a set of enterprise offerings which are around information, mail, applications, and documents. And we've been pleased with the willingness of customers to now accelerate their trials. Now, I'd like to think this is because our products are brilliant, clever, and wonderful and consistent with cloud computing. Another possible explanation is their budgets are very, very tight, and our stuff is just a lot cheaper.
Yep.
Either one of those is acceptable from our perspective, because we'll earn the right of that customer over time. So the answer to the question is, what does 2010 look like? A lot of that depends on what the growth rate of the recovery will look like, and nobody at this point knows what a global recovery is going to look like. But it's reasonable to expect that although we've gotten off of the online penetration, we'll get back to that, because the trends are still all in that direction.
On that cheery note, let's talk about music videos.
Okay.
The YouTube, to me, as a consumer, is sort of like MTV was 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. And you haven't monetized it yet the way you are starting to. There are initial signs, or I don't know how many instances you're doing this in where you're selling the music, either MP3s via Amazon or iTunes via Apple, with some of your most used videos. How do you see both the artists using that venue over the next 1 to 2 years as they're dealing with their own contracts with the industry, and how do you see the monetization for the artists and for YouTube playing out? Just as one example of, and you may want to focus on another way that YouTube is increasingly going to be monetized.
Well, YouTube is slowly getting the monetization right. It's taken us much longer than we had hoped to get it right. I've always been concerned that the aggregate monetization of online does not replace the lost revenue for offline. That's the fundamental conundrum of the music industry. It's a potential conundrum for the video and movie industries, and everybody's very worried about this. So we're working hard on that. The music industry as a whole has the following problem. In the 1980s, they believe, their self-view is that they helped create MTV, which is a very successful property, obviously, by giving them licenses to music videos, quote, too cheaply, according to their view. And so there's an ongoing battle, business discussion, whatever term you want to do, about how do you compensate the music industry for the use of the music in things which are promotional.
Yep.
And I don't know how that's going to resolve itself. Apple, and I think you know, as you know, I'm on the board of Apple, successfully has worked that out with iTunes after a lot of arguing. Yep. And I think iTunes is a very positive example of this. We need an analogous example of the way music videos will work in the internet. YouTube is very successful with music videos. It's also very successful with sports, comedy, and other sort of humor. And we are working hard on longer form content and HD content. Because YouTube has so many viewers, right, literally this huge audience, if we can get even small amounts of profit because of the scale, add to big numbers fairly quickly.
Some of the obstacles in the way with regards to getting more content on YouTube have been the Viacoms of the world and the major media companies.
That would be a $1 billion lawsuit.
That would be a $1 billion lawsuit. Just anyway, I'm not going to go down that path. But if we look at the financial results for those media companies in the fourth quarter, using News Corp as an example, their local TV revenue was down 30% plus. Meaning if you, and I mentioned this earlier today, but the trajectory that the local TV and broadcast TV is on is sort of similar. Just if you look at a chart to where newspapers were a year ago, is it possible that that group of players who have been standoff to you and not wanting to participate may change their view, simply given that their economic situation is different than it was before?
Well, I would hope so. And you know, they see the same numbers that we do, and we understand their problem. And we are critically dependent upon the creation of this high-quality content. There's only so much user-generated video that everybody's going to want, and there's a real reason why professionally produced narrative is so successful. You know, just watch the Oscars and get a sense of how important it is to society. My view is that you asked the question, if I may, in sort of the wrong order. The right way to answer the question is, what does the future look like? And then how does everybody's models adapt to that? Okay, so let's.
Well, we know what the future looks like.
Well, let's say it, because I think people often are a little confused about it. The fact of the matter is that mobile devices are going to be the majority of the way people get information. And the argument is relatively simple. You already have them. They're called your phones. And over the next 5 or 10 years, these phones, if you just do a simple Moore's Law calculation, will have the capacity to do much of the entertainment and communication and so forth that you use in other media. And you're seeing that today. So you have a business model issue. But there's not a question of how people are going to spend their time. So let's go through what these devices look like. They've got a GPS on them, so they know where you are. They know they're personal, so they know what you've seen, and they don't show you the same thing over and over again, like my television. You know, the same show over and over again. Show it just once. It's highly, highly personal. It can do excerpts. And of course, it's also summary form. So the combination of all of that means a huge change in the business model. And I don't think we know exactly how that'll monetize. But what we do know is that those products are getting built. And so the challenge and the opportunity is to figure out how to make money in that. But you won't get there by suing your end users. You won't get there by preventing this technology from happening. It's going to happen.
What was that again?
It's going to happen.
The two last questions from me, and Vic did a great job on a panel on mobile, the mobile internet a few moments ago. But would you be willing to opine in your lifetime when mobile-related revenue from search might surpass PC-based revenue? Given that we now know where the future is going?
It clearly will, and it's a question of the growth rate of data-capable mobile devices. The reason it clearly will is that the monetization of the ads should be higher because they're even more targeted. So we have a lot of evidence, and Vic talks about this in his speeches, where when you have a powerful browser, whether it's the iPhone is a good example, the BlackBerry now has one, obviously the Android phones as they come out. People spend many, many more searches when they finally have a capable browser. And so one of the questions is sort of what's new in the technology sense as opposed to the financial market sense. And the development of this new open source browser that all these things are based on really does create that first step of a whole new platform. So how long does it take? The answer is a few years, but not a few decades.
Yep, that's good. The one last question from me, I'll turn it over to others. You have been a great partner with your revenue sharing agreements with thousands or millions of other players. You don't necessarily get the credit for it. In my humble opinion, you should. But you're offering those sorts of compelling deals to content providers. You're offering an Android operating system to the mobile device market. And this goes back, it's the same question slightly differently. Do those offers become more compelling to standouts in the next 6 to 12 months than they have been in the past?
You mean people who have previously said no?
Yep.
Well, I think one of the first principles of business is that they say no this year and maybe they'll say yes next year. We're working really hard to create ecosystems that have enough differentiation and enough innovation that people want to play play in them. And we're also trying to do business terms that are non-exclusive, right? So that in fact that everybody gets access to it. So there's certainly no prohibition for people doing it. In the Android case, it was discussed at the 3GSM conference that there are quite a few partners that have pre-announced their intent to offer Android-based devices of one kind. And some of these things look like phones, but some of them are in fact not phones. And that obviously then creates the cycle for more applications, and that'll bring more people to the party. I think people in the room here understand how platform businesses work, and it's fundamentally about momentum. You know, can you get enough players? Can you get enough of the pieces to go? And if you offer a sufficiently compelling value proposition and a real differentiator, these things can grow very, very big very quickly. I think the lesson of the internet is that new businesses can grow very, very quickly when you get just the right combination of things and you get scale.
And in the mobile internet, we have it.
Yeah, we clearly have had that this year. And by the way, we've been waiting for years. So we've talked about this for a long time. So again, in the what's new, I think it's finally there.
Who would have thought that the best thing that could have ever happened to the mobile internet is that the growth was constrained by the carriers and their decks for so long, and that it would happen to get traction at the time when the economy was in a very tough.
And one of the interesting things about the carriers is the carriers are looking for new sources of data revenue. And you asked comment earlier about the netbooks. Some of the carriers are saying, well, why don't we subsidize all of these different kinds of devices in the same way that they do with mobile phones today. Everybody understands the mobile phone plans and they're subsidized and so forth to get those things out of there. And again, that's another new thing that I think it will serve as an accelerant to an already exciting industry.
Any questions? Yep. We're going to wait for the mic this time.
Thanks. Greg Tarkross, Pacific Capital. Mary mentioned Japan is really leading in the mobile internet, and wanted to understand what you're optimistic about in terms of other countries that are coming along. Certainly it's not this country, but other countries that you think would follow the footsteps in Japan with mobile advertising, other revenue. Second question is, what is your venture capital and M&A strategy going forward?
With Japan, we have now partnerships, I think, with two or the three, depending on exactly how you define, of the leading mobile providers. And the monetization is excellent. And so when you get it right, when you have the right ad product and the right search product on the right device, and of course Japan, the products themselves are all different. Anyone who's spent there, try to get your own phone to work in their networks. So we know that as a proof point, and that's been true for a couple of years. So we're now attempting to replicate those kinds of deals. The obvious prize will be China because of the simple volume there. And there's enough growth in CPMs and basically application use and wireless data networks in China that that's sort of the next really, really big one. Penetration for mobile devices in Europe is very strong, but the economies are not so strong. We'll wait and see what happens there.
You mentioned
I'm sorry, second question. I apologize. You asked a question about the venture arm and M&A strategy. We've largely been waiting for prices to get better. And a lot of the good news is we have lots of capital, and the bad news is we're still trying to get everybody into the model that we really want in terms of the M&A, and I think it'll start soon, but it's pretty inactive right now. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned in your a few minutes ago here that you were in strong support of the new increases in government spending in the stimulus program. Could you explain a little bit perhaps how you expect to benefit from the new stimulus program, and what do you say to the argument that if government spending were the answer, the Soviet Union would have been the richest country in the world?
I have a very long and strong answer to the last part of the question, but in the interest of time, I'll say that we benefit when our customers have jobs because they buy stuff. So any solution that gets the middle class, if you will, to feel more confident benefits Google, our advertising revenue, our customers, our partners, and our shareholders. So we can debate the specifics. As you know, the current stimulus package no one's ever done it at this scale before. It's 2/3 is directed spending and 1/3 is tax credits of one kind or another, much of which goes to the state and local governments and for extended unemployment benefits, and then various things involving the AMT. With respect to how Google would specifically benefit beyond that, it's more a question of how does the internet benefit, and the stimulus package has on it on the order of 20 billion of essentially payments, subsidies, and credits that cause the build out of the fast internet, broadband internet, to occur more quickly. It also has about $20 billion in increases in science funding, which we believe will go into universities that will then help with a lag, help build some of the new and creative applications that we depend on.
Eric, in the past, you've talked about where you were in terms of monetization of existing properties and existing applications. I was wondering if you could sort of give us an update on where you think you are. I mean, of the things you can control, monetization of your properties is one of them, and where you think you are at this point, and what this downturn means in terms of accelerating monetization. Thanks.
There's always a danger when you have a website that you temporarily over-monetize. In other words, you take your page and you fill it with ads. And that works for a quarter or two, and then your customers say, well, you know, heck, it's an ad page rather than a content page, and then they move somewhere else. So we, Google, are roughly at our monetization, or what we call coverage level, of about a year ago. And that feels about right. It's frankly a judgment. There's some science behind it, but it's within a range of what we have historically done. We have looked at other properties that have a lot of page views and much of the social networking things, for example. And they don't monetize that well, and they don't monetize nearly as well as text search. So we're unlikely to do major changes there, although we're trying a few things. Another way of asking your question is, where is the next source of revenue? And the next source of revenue is the current business functioning better with better conversion, more traffic, more advertisers, which is our core business. The next and adjacent business is a set of display businesses and an exchange that are being built as a consequence of the DoubleClick acquisition. The display business is as large as the text search business. It's relatively balkanized. It's not a uniform in any particular way. The systems are complicated. The way the display ads are managed is done in many cases by hand or by poor quality spreadsheets. So we see an opportunity to apply the Google magic, the measurement and the scaling in that business, and that's probably the next big one.
Any other questions? Yep, right here. We'll move beyond the first 3 rows at some point.
Thank you. Wanted to get your thoughts on Twitter. There's been a lot of discussion there that potentially it evolves as a real-time search engine, and in an un-Google-like way, you haven't really responded with any sort of application or product there outside of maybe Blogger. How do you foresee that product in the next few years, and is that a potential or a threat for Google?
We're in favor of all of these new communications mechanisms. Google just put up a Google Twitter site, if you will, so Google can tweet to you. It's called at Google. And so you can go ahead and listen to our ruminations as to where we are and what we're doing in 160 characters or less. Speaking as a computer scientist, I view all of these as sort of poor man's email systems. In other words, they have aspects of an email system, but they don't have a full offering. So to me, the question about companies like Twitter is, do they fundamentally evolve as sort of a note phenomena, or do they fundamentally evolve to have storage, revocation, identity, and all the other aspects that traditional email systems have? Or do email systems themselves broaden what they do to take on some of that characteristic? I think the innovation is great. In Google's case, we have a very successful instant messaging product, and that's what most people end up using. And having said that, I think it's wonderful. Twitter's success is wonderful, and I think it shows you that there are many, many new ways to reach and communicate, especially if you're willing to do so publicly.
Any other questions? Yep. Oh, we're moving to the 4th row, 3rd row.
Another big picture question, if you don't mind. You said the economy is dire and that you don't see a sign of a current bottom. But as you look around the world, you're seeing many regional differences in how badly areas are affected. And then in general, just as a worldwide view, how do you feel about broadband penetration rates, especially in Latin America, but elsewhere around the world, and whether the economic slowdown is going to dampen that move toward broadband penetration in other countries aside from the U.S.?
What's interesting is Latin America is doing so well. I was joking with my friend who lives in Mexico that maybe Mexico should bail out the United States. And the fact of the matter is that the Latin American economies are now in a position of having higher growth than many of the other countries worldwide. I don't think we see anything different than what's been publicly reported, which goes something like this. The United States, because of our economic structure, is likely to both have a quicker descent and a quicker recovery than Europe. That Europe is offset by some number of quarters, and we believe that all of that is true based on the data that we've seen. We also believe that India and China are being affected, but to a lesser degree for all the reasons that have been said publicly. What we don't know is, what does this do to the long-term capital structure of these economies? I don't think anybody knows when all of the government stimulus is done. And remember that the government stimulus and crisis here is not as bad as, for example, as what we're seeing in Britain or, for heaven's sakes, Iceland. We don't really know what the extent of that will be in terms of both the nationalization questions of the institutions of those industries and consumer confidence and savings rate. There's sort of negative examples if you look at Japan, which is after 13 years of recession, Japan went from essentially a culture that was at least interested in brands and at least interested in sort of real consumer behavior as defined by America, to a country that was sufficiently traumatized that they're now very, very heavy net savers because their economic structure and labor markets also changed to also favor much more at-risk employment. Those are big changes if you're Japanese. And I don't think anybody knows to what degree that will affect the United States. My personal view, and I've said this very strongly, is that Americans love their credit cards. And that if you think about what we have to do in our country, we basically have to solve the credit problem, we have to get the job situation at least stable so people are not afraid of losing their jobs, and we have to do something about the housing crisis. All of those issues are being worked on now. When those things are done, it's a reasonable bet that Americans will go back to what we do best, which is to spend money.
There's just one non-Google question, Eric, and it's just, this question made me think of it, but you talked about the stimulus package, and as consumers and on Wall Street, we don't see a lot of the impact of the stimulus package with any immediacy, but that's not the point. Or that's not the question. On the academic side, the institutions that are going to get some of the spending have a good sense of when they're going to get it, but who's going to get it. They're prioritizing. They're really excited. You grew up in your business career in Silicon Valley. You grew up in an industry and with a company, Sun, that might not have existed but for government funding and AT&T support. And I'm stretching the facts here a little bit to make a different point. Are you confident, given what you've heard, given where you've been over the course of the last several weeks, that we're going to, the American economy will see some good things come out of that directed spending that is going into academic institutions? This unlike what we have seen in a very long time?
I am, and I think there's a lot of reasons to be very optimistic. And I know everybody is sort of depressed, and you read the headlines and watch the television and so forth. But the American story is a story of innovation. And the system of universities that we have, the young founders that come out of universities that form great companies, the ability to do quickly the capital formation in the venture industry and so forth is unparalleled. If you look at where jobs come from, they come from the private sector, and high-paying jobs come from people who work in knowledge-intensive industries that are sophisticated, or very high-end manufacturing jobs. So it seems obvious to me that part of the way to get this fixed for the longer term, and I'm not talking about the regulatory failures, which was another separate and long conversation, is to make sure that the necessary preconditions are present for entrepreneurs and existing businesses to either reuse existing capital plants to build, for example, the classic example here is batteries for hybrid cars in the United States as opposed to in Korea and in Germany, and basically get those jobs in the United States. That's ultimately the answer to all of the incessant criticism that you hear about jobs moving to India and China and service wages and so forth and so on. It's ultimately about the extraordinary asset that we have in our universities and our research labs to essentially create the next Google, and not just in our industry.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, go ahead, and Eric will repeat it.
Getting back to the display business, as you talked about, what are the 3 things that need to happen for it to become a material part of your business?
The question was, what are the 3 things that it needs to get done to become part of a material part of our business? Let me ask your question without the word material in the middle of it, because material has a very specific meaning. The first problem, if you're a display, if you have essentially a display property, you want to sort of show ads, it's very difficult to figure out which ad to show, because there are multiple vendors who show you these ads. And we're in the process of building the equivalent of an ad exchange, which will allow you to do that automatically and do it with scientific measurements. So today what people do is they use heuristics, and the heuristics in that space are terrible. The second issue in display has to do with standardization of ad formats. So again, here you are, you have a property, you have a place for display, and there's not agreement at the level that it needs to be on the standardization of the display, the delivery of the display, and especially around interactive and video ads. So if you think about it, the future of display ads is not a static picture, but rather an ad that brings you in, that tells you a narrative. The best ads add real value to the consumer's experience. We take the view that ads are valuable if they're targeted and are information rich. And the most information rich by by obvious argument, is something which involves video and a story and a narrative and more references. And the technology will enable the creation of those. And then the third, in our case, is the construction of the business relationship with the large advertisers, which we're working on.
If there's a 10-second question and a 20-second answer, fire away.
So Eric, one of the things that's helped Google grow so much faster than the competition has been the balance sheet along with better search. You potentially on the horizon have a consolidation of search. You potentially on the horizon have a consolidation of searches if two competitors merge with a much better capitalized capital structure. How do you see any potential impact should Microsoft and Yahoo come together, given you started off the conversation talking about consumers can be fickle switching search engines? Thanks.
I don't know if that scenario will occur. We did our best attempt at a deal with Yahoo, and as you know, we had to cancel it at the very last minute. So we wish them the best of luck. And Carol's a fine and able CEO. What do I really think will happen here? I think that the problem has to do with Microsoft's ability to use its Windows monopoly to restrict consumer choice. That's not a new subject. It's been discussed at great length. So anything that Microsoft would do that would eliminate consumer choice with respect to search engines, internet browsers, distribution, for which it was previously found guilty, are of concern. And there's a history of that. So that's what we worry about. I think as long as the technologies are competing on a fair-to-fair basis, I think that's great.
On that note, Eric, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.